The 1967 Ford Mustang had sat in the dark for 40 years, untouched, unstarted, coated in a silence so complete it felt permanent. Alexandra Whitmore had hired 5 of the best classic restoration specialists in the country, and every one of them had given up. It was her father's car, a man she had not spoken to for 2 years before he died, a wound she never got to close. But there was one man on a forgotten street in Millbrook who knew that engine like a language only he could read. The day he started it, everything changed. What was hidden inside that car? Stay with this story. What comes next will change everything you thought you knew. Mason Cole opened the doors to Cole's Auto at 6 in the morning, the same as every other day. The shop sat on Glenwood Street, a narrow strip of asphalt in the middle of Millbrook, Virginia, where 2-story buildings leaned against each other and the early light came in sideways through the front windows. From outside it was unremarkable. The sign above the door had not been repainted in years, and the concrete apron was permanently stained in dark rings where oil had dripped for decades. But inside, the tools were arranged with a precision that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with intention. Every wrench hung at the same angle on the same peg, every akaket tray was sorted by diameter, then by depth, then by the frequency with which it was needed. There was a photograph on the corner of the main workbench, a woman with dark hair and a quiet expression, and Mason never explained it to anyone because no one who came into the shop ever asked. That morning, a 1972 Chevrolet occupied the main bay. Mason had been working on it for 3 days, long enough to understand why 3 other shops had turned the job away. The carburetor had been rebuilt incorrectly sometime in the previous decade, by someone who had known enough to be dangerous and not enough to be careful, and the correction required dismantling half the fuel system to get back to the original problem. He worked in near silence, using tools that most mechanics had never encountered and adjusting specifications from memory rather than from any chart on the wall. Around 8 o'clock, a man named Joseph knocked on the open bay door, in his early 70s, a canvas jacket regardless of the weather, the kind of man who had run out of other options before arriving at Cole's Auto. Joseph watched for a moment and then said that a shop on Franklin Avenue had called the engine too far gone, and that another place across town had quoted him $3,000 and a month's wait before ultimately giving up. Mason listened to all of this without slowing his hands. Joseph asked, with the tentative directness of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, why Mason had never opened a second location, taken on staff, moved somewhere with more foot traffic. The question landed in the shop and sat there. Mason wiped his hands on a gray shop rag and looked at the question the way a person looks at a language they once spoke fluently and no longer need. He said he had enough. Joseph did not press it. The Chevrolet was ready before noon, and when Joseph drove it out onto Glenwood and heard the engine run clean and even, no hesitation, no rattle, just smooth forward motion, he sat in the lot for a full minute before pulling away. Mason watched from the bay door, then went back inside without ceremony. There was still the rest of the day, and then the next day, and the rhythm of it was something he had come to rely on in the absence of other structures. On the back shelf of the storage room, behind a deck of technical journals printed in German and Italian, there was a cardboard box sealed with tape that had gone amber and brittle at the seams. The journals were not the kind found in an ordinary repair shop. They were engineering publications from European manufacturers, dense with stress calculations and tolerances listed in hundredths of a millimeter. The box had not been opened in several years. Mason walked past it twice during the afternoon without looking at it directly. The way a person navigates around something they have decided not to think about until they are forced to. He was eating lunch at the workbench, a paper bag from the sandwich place 2 blocks over, when his phone rang just before 1 o'clock. The woman on the line identified herself as Carter Hayes and said she was calling on behalf of Whitmore Industries. She asked if he accepted classic restoration work. Mason set down the second half of his sandwich and asked what kind of car. Alexandra Whitmore was standing at her desk on the 35th floor of Whitmore Tower when Carter came back with a one-word answer: interested. The office was long and spare, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reduced the city below to a diagram of streets and blocks and small moving things, a scale that made every problem look containable from a distance. Alexandra was not looking at the view. She was holding a printed document that Logan Pierce's office had sent by courier that morning. The kind of theatrical gesture Logan made when he wanted to ensure something was noticed. The document was a formal acquisition proposal for Whitmore Industries, priced at 30% below fair market valuation, with a board vote requested in 3 weeks. Logan Pierce ran Pierce Capital, a firm that had built its reputation by identifying companies at their moment of greatest vulnerability and moving without hesitation. He had chosen this particular moment with the precision of someone who had done it many times before, and Edward Whitmore's death 4 months earlier had given him exactly the opening he was waiting for. Edward had died at 72, in the house where Alexandra had grown up, and they had not spoken for 2 years before that. The silence between them had been the kind that accumulates in layers, missed calls, misread signals, things said at the wrong moment that neither of them had figured out how to retract. He left her everything, the company, the properties, the accounts, and the Mustang in the garage that had not been driven in 40 years. Alexandra had first seen the car again while visiting the house to begin settling the estate, standing in the garage doorway in her work clothes while dust moved in the thin light above the hood. She had been very young the last time she stood in that garage with her father. Young enough that the memory came back not as a scene but as a sensation, the smell of motor oil and warm metal, his hand resting on the hood, his voice telling her that one day he would fix it, and the two of them would drive around the city with the windows down. That day had not come. Neither had the others he had promised. A week after the acquisition proposal arrived, Logan Pierce found her at a charity dinner in a ballroom that was too warm and smelled of cut flowers and polished floors. He was calm in the way of someone who believes the outcome is already decided. He mentioned the Mustang in passing, not as a question but as a conclusion, and said Edward had always held on to things he never used, and the car in the garage was the clearest example of that habit. He said it was old iron on concrete. Alexandra held her glass and looked at him and said nothing. But something shifted in her that evening. The dismissal had been calculated, she understood that immediately, designed to suggest that her father's legacy was sentimental and fragile and that she should move toward the offer before things became worse. Instead, it produced the opposite effect. By the time she left the hotel, she had made a decision. The Mustang would be restored and displayed at the Edward Whitmore Memorial Gala in 3 weeks. It would be her answer to the board, to Logan, and to anyone watching. Whitmore Industries was not available. 4 restoration shops declined the job before the week was out. The first said the fuel system required factory components that no longer existed commercially. The second looked under the hood for 20 minutes and returned the keys without explanation. The third offered to handle the exterior only and said starting the engine was not something they were prepared to attempt. The fourth sent a written assessment with the word unfeasible in the second sentence. Carter compiled the rejections and placed them on Alexandra's desk. She read the document once and told Carter to find someone else. He asked whether she meant someone outside the state. She said she meant whoever was actually capable, wherever that person happened to be. Evelyn Nash lived in a yellow house on the east side of Millbrook with a desk in the front room covered in files from projects she was no longer officially involved with. She was 68 years old, had spent most of her career in financial operations, and had worked for more than a decade at Harrington Automotive during the years when that company was producing some of the finest restoration engineering in the eastern United States. Carter found her through a Classic Car Owners Association, a chain of referrals that started with a retired engineer in Charlottesville and passed through several people who all said some version of the same thing. When Carter arrived at the Yellow House on a Tuesday afternoon and described the Mustang and its condition, Evelyn listened without interrupting. She asked the production year, the model code, and whether the engine block had any markings near the timing cover. Carter had photographed everything. She nodded and said there was exactly one person for this job. His name was Mason Cole and he had a shop on Glenwood Street. Carter asked why a man in a one-base shop could do what 5 specialists could not. Evelyn looked at him evenly and said, "Go ask him." Alexandra did not send Carter a second time. She went herself without calling ahead on a Thursday morning when the air still held the last of autumn. She drove alone, which was unusual enough that her assistant noticed and said nothing. Cole's auto looked exactly as she had expected. A serviceable building with a faded sign, 2 bay doors, a concrete apron stained in concentric dark rings. The front door was open. Inside, the smell of metal and petroleum sat in the air the way it does in every shop, but beneath it there was something else. A cleanliness to the organization that contradicted the worn surfaces. Every tool occupied a specific location. The floor was swept. On the back shelf were journals with foreign lettering on the spines, and under the main workbench a cardboard box sat sealed with old tape, and something about the tidiness of the place next to the age of everything in it suggested a man who was disciplined about the things that mattered to him and indifferent to the things that did not. Mason was underneath a truck. She stood near the center of the floor, and then the rolling cart shifted and a pair of boots appeared, and then he was on his feet, wiping his hands on a gray rag, looking at her with an expression that disclosed nothing in particular. She introduced herself by name and by company. He acknowledged the information and waited. She described the Mustang, its year, its condition as she understood it, the 4 shops that had declined, the 3-week deadline. When she finished, he asked 3 questions: the serial number near the timing cover, the carburetor type, and the last recorded mileage. She could not answer any of them, and the inability irritated her more than she expected. Not because he had asked the questions, but because she had walked into a conversation without preparation, which was something she did not normally allow. When he turned to get a notepad from the back counter, she looked around the shop with the same evaluating gaze she used in due diligence meetings. The old calendar on the wall, the scratched workbench, the photograph at the corner that no one had pointed out to her. When he returned, she told him she would pay double the standard rate if he accepted the work. Then she glanced around the shop a second time and said she needed results, not reassurances from a place like this one. Mason stopped writing. He looked at her directly, not for long, not with visible reaction, and then said in a tone that was completely level, did she want him to look at the car or not? Alexandra was not accustomed to having a deliberate insult passed over that cleanly, as though it were simply not worth addressing. She said yes. The car would arrive in 2 days. Deadline was 3 weeks, before the night of the gala. When she left, Mason stood in the bay doorway and watched the car pull onto Glenwood. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a thread moved. He had encountered the name Whitmore before, not recently, but before, he could not yet place where. The flatbed truck arrived Saturday at 7 in the morning before Mason had finished his first coffee. When the tarp was removed, he set his cup down and did not pick it up again. The car was the color of deep water, a navy blue so dark it was almost black in the shadow of the shop, with a white rally stripe that had faded to cream along the driver's side. The chrome trim had oxidized at the edges. The windshield held a fine crack running from the lower right corner, but the lines of the body were intact. The hood, the quarter panels, the rear deck, all of it was there beneath the years, undamaged in the ways that mattered. Mason walked around the car once, slowly, without touching it. He stopped at the driver's side sill, crouched, and read the serial number stamped into the metal below the doorframe. He knew that number. Not because he had seen this specific car, but because the serial block it belonged to had appeared in specifications he had worked from 15 years earlier at Harrington Automotive, during a project that had been canceled without explanation 3 days before he was called into a conference room and handed his termination. The project had involved 3 vehicles from this exact production run. He had spent 4 months developing the restoration protocol for the engine series, work that existed in no public manual, derived from testing and documented entirely by his own hand. He stood up, looked at the car for a moment, then went inside and pulled the cardboard box from under the workbench. The tape split at the seam. Inside were folded drawings, internal documents, handwritten logs, the things he had taken on his last day because they were his original work, and he had not known what else to do with them. He found the folder for the Mustang engine series and opened it on the workbench. He already knew he could fix this car. What he did not yet know was what that was going to mean. Carter arrived at 10:30 in a manner that managed to be simultaneously professional and pressured. He asked for an assessment. Mason said he needed a week before he could offer one. Carter said a week was considerable. Mason said it was less time than it would take to do the job wrong. Carter looked at the open folder on the workbench. Diagrams and columns of figures dense enough to be meaningless to most people, yet specific enough to suggest that they meant something to the man standing beside them, and left the answer where it was. He said he would convey the timeline. He left without pressing further. Mason worked until 8 that evening, cataloging the work ahead: fuel delivery, electrical harness, ignition assembly, and then the engine itself, which was where everything else depended. That night, after shop was locked and Glenwood Street had gone quiet, he sat at the workbench with the folder from the box and read from the first page to the last, the way a person returns to something they once wrote and finds it still holds. The first week was fuel and electrical, clearing the path before asking anything of the engine itself. Mason sourced components from 3 specialized suppliers, none of them accessible through ordinary channels. 2 parts he fabricated at the bench lathe in the back room, matching dimensions from his own notes to tolerances that standard replacement parts did not meet. He worked 6 days, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark. There was no radio when he was in deep concentration. The only sounds were the tools, the occasional car on Glenwood, and at intervals the low creak of the building cooling in the evening. By the end of the first week, the fuel system was clean and pressurized, and the electrical harness had been rewired at every point where 40 years had eaten through the insulation. It was while dismantling the dashboard panel to access the gauge cluster wiring that he found the envelope. It was wedged between the back face of the panel and the firewall, held by a bracket that had been slightly bent to create just enough of a gap. The envelope was manila, yellowed at the edges, sealed with tape that had gone stiff with age. He held it under the work light for a moment. On the front, pressed firmly enough in the pen strokes that the letters were slightly indented. For Alexandra. He set it on the far corner of the bench, away from the tools and the grease and everything else. He did not open it. Whatever Edward Whitmore had concealed inside that car for his daughter was not his to read. He returned to the wiring and did not look at the envelope again for the rest of the evening. Alexandra arrived that Friday without notice, Carter behind her. She stopped in the bay doorway and took in the state of the car. Dashboard removed, instrument cluster on a cloth-covered bench, door panels off, fuel lines disconnected from the frame, and the expression on her face was not distress exactly, but the involuntary reaction of someone who had expected controlled progress and was confronting what controlled progress actually looked like before it resolved into something clean. Mason was at the back of the bay, adjusting a bracket. He acknowledged her presence and kept working. She asked why so much had been removed. He said he needed to understand what was connected to what before touching the center of it. She said she had not asked for a complete disassembly. He set down the bracket, turned and said, did she want it to start once and fail at the roadside, or did she want it to run the way it was designed to run? She did not answer, because there was only one reasonable response, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of saying it aloud. They stood near the car after that, and the silence between them was different from the silences that had occupied the shop before, less neutral, more weighted. Alexandra was looking at the navy paint on the rear quarter panel, seeing something that was not exactly the paint. She said in a tone that came from somewhere outside her usual register. There was something strange about watching beautiful things sit unused for years. Mason set down his tools. He said it was not always strange. He said sometimes people were waiting for the right moment, and the moment simply never arrived. He said it without looking at her, the way a person says something true that they have held for a long time without deciding to share it. Alexandra did not reply. She left a few minutes afterward, and Mason went back to work, and the envelope sat on the corner of the bench where he had placed it. In the second week, Logan Pierce arranged what he framed as an informal lunch with Carter. Just staying connected, he said, the way he framed everything that was actually calculated. He mentioned, as though he had only just heard it, that Alexandra was using a small independent shop to restore her father's car. He suggested the board would find it revealing, an indicator of judgment under pressure. Carter listened with the polished neutrality of someone who had managed information flows in corporate environments for 15 years and had learned which conversations to report immediately. He told Alexandra that afternoon. She was at the window when Carter told her the same position she held when working through something that required distance. She was quiet long enough that Carter prepared to repeat himself. Then she said, if the car was not ready, she would take full responsibility for that. She said not to discuss Logan Pierce with her unless he did something requiring a legal response. Alexandra came to the shop alone on a Tuesday night during the second week. The lights inside were still on at 8:30. She had driven past once before turning in, not from indecision but from some uncertainty about what she was doing there that she had not yet resolved. Inside, a small radio on the shelf near the door was playing jazz, a station that drifted in and out of clarity with the signal. Mason was at the workbench, soldering a connection in the rewired harness, the work light throwing a sharp circle over his hands. He did not hear her enter. She stood near the bay door, and then she saw the envelope on the corner of the bench. She recognized the handwriting before she could stop herself from recognizing it. Her father's script, the same forward-leaning letters from every note he had ever left her, and the sight of her own name in his hand, on a yellowed envelope that had been sealed inside a car she had not looked at in years, moved through her like a current she had not been prepared to feel. Mason noticed her when she was a few feet from the bench. He set down the soldering iron and said he had found it behind the dashboard panel while accessing the wiring. He said he had not opened it. She reached out and took the envelope, and for a moment the fact that her hands were not entirely steady was visible to both of them and acknowledged by neither. She put it inside her coat. She said thank you quietly enough that it carried its full weight. They stood in the shop for a moment without speaking, the jazz low on the shelf, the work light still burning, the engine of the Mustang sitting silent in the bay, and the weight of the space between them shifted in a way that was small but was real. She left without saying anything further. Mason watched the door close, looked at the corner of the bench where the envelope had been, and returned to work. On the 18th day, Mason called Carter at 7 in the morning and said, "Come to the shop and bring Alexandra." He offered nothing else. Carter asked if the news was good. Mason said, "Come and see." Alexandra arrived 40 minutes later, still in the dark coat she wore on weekends. She had come from home without stopping at the office, without the surface armor the office required. The Mustang sat at the center of the bay. The body panels were back in place. The dashboard had been reassembled. The trim had been polished. The paint remained untouched. That was the final stage. But every structural and mechanical element of the car had been resolved, and the overall impression was of something that had been not simply repaired but returned, to itself, to the condition that had always been latent beneath the decades of dust and silence. Mason picked up the key from the bench without commentary, got into the driver's seat and looked through the windshield at Alexandra standing at the bay entrance. He put the key in and turned it. The V8 engine started on the first attempt. It did not sputter or hesitate or turn over reluctantly the way an old machine does when it is being forced into motion against its nature. It ran. The sound was deep and even and authoritative, not loud but total, filling the shop from concrete floor to the rafters and going through the walls and sitting in the chest of anyone within range of it. Alexandra did not move. Her hands were at her sides, and her face held the expression of someone who has prepared for a moment carefully and discovered that preparation is not the same as readiness. The sound lasted perhaps 15 seconds before Mason switched the engine off and stepped out of the car. In those 15 seconds, something in her expression settled, not grief and not relief, but the specific quality of a debt being acknowledged before it can be paid. Carter was standing behind her and said nothing. Mason set the key on the hood. He said there were 2 days of cosmetic work remaining before the gala. Alexandra looked at him and asked how he had done it. He said he knew the engine. By noon that same day, an anonymous email had reached the personal accounts of 4 Whitmore Industries board members. The attached document summarized Mason Cole's departure from Harrington Automotive 15 years prior, framing an unsubstantiated allegation of improper disclosure as though it were a settled professional matter. No finding had ever been made in any formal proceeding. No court had been involved. But the summary was written to suggest wrongdoing as established fact, and it arrived alongside a note implying that Alexandra Whitmore's choice of this individual reflected poorly on her judgment at a critical moment for the company. The note bore a reference to Logan Pierce's office. Carter had the email in front of him within the hour and brought it to Alexandra without framing it. She drove to the shop the following morning and placed the document on the workbench in front of Mason. He read it. He set it down. He said, "Did she want their version or his?" She said his. He sat on the stool and told her in the same measured tone he used for everything else. 15 years earlier, he had been the lead engineer in a restoration and engine development division at Harrington Automotive, the one responsible for a class of projects that did not appear in any public catalog, requiring custom engineering derived from original research. In the autumn of that year, a representative of an outside firm accused him of sharing proprietary specifications with a competing buyer. There was no evidence. He was told that regardless of guilt or innocence, the company needed to protect itself, and that his departure was the cleanest solution. He had accepted the terms because his wife was sick by then, and fighting the matter would have taken everything he had left. He had kept the technical documents because they were his own original work, and because he had not known what else to do with them. He had not spoken of it again. Alexandra listened to all of it without speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked who had filed the accusation at Harrington. Mason held her gaze for 2 seconds before answering. He said the allegation had come through a representative acting on behalf of a financial acquisitions firm that had been pursuing certain project rights at Harrington during that same period. He said the name of the firm. He said the name of the man behind it. He said, Logan Pierce. The color did not leave her face, but something behind her eyes went very still, the particular stillness of a suspicion becoming certainty. That night, alone in her father's study, she opened the envelope. She sat at the desk in the one room of the house she had not yet changed, the lamp on and everything else dark, and she unfolded 3 pages of her father's handwriting on the stationery he had used his entire professional life. He wrote that he had known about the Harrington matter for several years. He had come to understand it through connections to the joint venture between Whitmore Industries and Harrington that had operated during the same period. A heritage vehicle development project in which Pierce Capital had shown early interest before being excluded. He had not spoken publicly because the disclosure would have implicated his own company in a failure to act, and because Logan Pierce had by then become too embedded in the industry for a confrontation to be uncomplicated. He wrote that this was the decision of his life that he most regretted. He wrote that the Mustang had remained untouched in the garage because every time he looked at it, he thought of the man who should have restored it, the man whose career he had allowed to be destroyed by his silence, whose work he had indirectly benefited from without acknowledgement or recourse. The car was not simply a car, it was a debt that had no other form. He asked Alexandra to find Mason Cole. He asked her to correct what had been done. He wrote, "Look, I kept everything except the thing that mattered most. Do not make the same choice." She read it twice. The second time slowly, the way a person reads something they intend to carry. She called Carter at 11 at night and told him she needed every internal record tied to the Harrington joint venture from 15 years back, whatever remained in the archive. She said to pull it regardless of what it touched. She sat at the desk until nearly 3 in the morning, with the lamp burning and her father's letter folded in front of her. Carter had files on the desk by 6. The records were incomplete. Routine purging had removed some documents. But enough remained. There was a licensing and transfer agreement between a Harrington subsidiary and a holding company that had since been dissolved, signed 6 months after Mason Cole's departure. The holding company traced back through 2 intermediary entities to Pierce Capital. The signature was not Logan Pierce's name, but the corporate chain was clear enough for an independent audit to follow. Carter placed a 2-page summary at the top and left the supporting materials in order behind it. Logan Pierce moved on the morning of the gala. He requested an emergency session of the Whitmore board, citing what he described as materially relevant concerns about executive decision-making. To be held that same afternoon, time to force a vote on the acquisition before the evening event, while Alexandra was in motion and the day was split in 2. The request reached Carter at 9 in the morning. Alexandra was in the car 10 minutes later. She arrived at the boardroom before Logan. She did not sit. She stood at the head of the table and placed 3 documents in front of the assembled members. The transfer agreement, Carter's 2-page chain of corporate connections, and the relevant passages of her father's letter. The section that named Logan Pierce by name and described what he had concealed and what had been allowed to follow from that concealment. She did not speak about Mason Cole's character or her own judgment. She spoke about the timeline. She spoke about the corporate chain. She said Logan Pierce had used the same method with at least 2 other companies before Whitmore Industries, and the pattern was documentable. She said the board could draw its own conclusions about what that meant for the acquisition proposal. A member from the finance committee requested an independent audit. 2 others immediately seconded. The acquisition vote was tabled pending the audit's completion. Logan Pierce sat across the table throughout and offered no response, which was the first time Alexandra had ever seen him without something prepared to say. While Alexandra was in the boardroom, Mason was in the shop. He had arrived before 5 in the morning following a call the previous night from Carter, who said the car may have been tampered with. The front door showed no sign of forced entry, which meant either a skilled lockpick or someone with access to a key. And there were only 2 keys in existence. He found the damage in his first examination. 4 components removed from the ignition and fuel delivery system, precisely enough that nothing appeared disturbed from a normal distance. They were small parts, but they sat at the convergence of every system that allowed the engine to function. He assessed the scope of the problem in under 5 minutes. He called Carter. He said the car had been interfered with. He said he needed 6 hours. He said to bring Alexandra to the gala that evening and not to worry about the car before then. He worked without stopping from 5 in the morning until early afternoon. He had compatible spare components from the sourcing work of the previous week, but compatibility was not equivalence. Each one had to be verified against spec before installation, calibrated against the engine's existing tolerances, tested in sequence. He did not eat. He did not sit down. He moved between the engine bay and the workbench in the focused, unhurried way of someone who has been asked many times in his life to remain calm and has found that this particular kind of problem is the only one that does not require any effort. The light in the shop moved from gray to pale yellow as the morning advanced. The sounds from Glenwood Street came and went. Mason worked through all of it as though the world outside the bay door had agreed temporarily not to be relevant. The Edward Whitmore Memorial Gala was held in the ballroom of a downtown hotel, under high ceilings and warm light, with 140 guests in evening dress. People who had known Edward Whitmore across decades of shared industry and had come partly to honor him and partly to assess what his absence had left behind. The program listed the Whitmore Industries Foundation's charitable commitments and a short film about the company's history. What the program did not list was the sound that reached the lobby at 7:30, deep, even, resonant, moving through the entrance and into the building and arriving in the ballroom before the image did, so that people were already turning toward the doors when the car came into view. The 1967 Ford Mustang rolled into the lit forecourt of the hotel slowly and without drama, navy blue against the dark of the evening, and everyone who saw it understood immediately that something had been accomplished that was not supposed to be possible. Mason stepped out in a plain dark suit that Carter had arranged. He was not a man who occupied a theatrical moment with any awareness of being watched. He got out of the car, closed the door, and walked to where Alexandra was standing at the edge of the entryway. He held out the key without a word. She took it. She walked to the car alone. She stood in front of it for a moment and placed one hand flat on the hood, the way a person touches something they have spent a long time trying to understand and have finally reached the surface of. Then she opened the driver's door and sat behind the wheel. The leather on the steering column had darkened and softened over decades. The original gauges were in the cluster before her. The smell inside the car was old fabric and metal and something underneath that, both of those things that she could not name but recognized. The way certain smells are not smells exactly but thresholds into specific moments that no longer exist. She sat without starting the engine, her hands in her lap, and nobody in the forecourt spoke, and the quiet lasted for as long as it needed to last. She got out. Her eyes were not dry, though not by much, and she crossed to where Mason was standing a few feet away. She asked if he had known whose car it was when he agreed to take the job. He said not at first. She asked when he had understood. He said when he read the serial number on the doorsill. She asked what that had told him. He said it was an engine series he had worked on a long time ago, before everything that followed, and the car had been on a list he had once cared about and had believed was closed. She held that for a moment. Then she said she was engaging a legal team to address the formal record at Harrington Automotive, to open the matter and pursue whatever documentation was needed to correct what had been done to it. Mason said she did not need to do that. She said she knew. She said it was the right thing regardless. It was the first sentence she had spoken to him that came from no calculation at all, only from the plain fact of what was owed, and she recognized it as such in the moment it left her mouth. It was, she thought, what her father had meant. Logan Pierce had been standing at the edge of the forecourt. He watched the car, and then he watched Alexandra, and then he turned without speaking to anyone and left the gala before the formal program had begun. The car remained in the forecourt for the entire evening. Guests circled it at intervals the way people circle things that have been restored to the condition they were always meant to hold, with a regard that was partly about the object itself and partly about what the object had required of everyone involved. The independent audit ran for 6 weeks and produced conclusions that Logan Pierce's legal team declined to address publicly. Pierce Capital withdrew the acquisition proposal for Whitmore Industries before the audit was formally complete. Logan Pierce stepped away from daily operations of his firm in the weeks that followed, citing personal reasons in a brief company statement. The Whitmore Industries board met 2 months after the gala for a routine session and did not raise the acquisition at any point in the agenda. The letter from Harrington Automotive arrived on an ordinary weekday in a standard envelope with a return address Mason recognized before he had finished picking it up from the floor. It was not a long document. It stated that the internal review of his separation from the company 15 years prior had been reopened in connection with recently disclosed information, and that the original allegation had been determined to have no factual basis. It expressed regret for the impact on his professional record. It was signed by the current head of human resources and countersigned by the general counsel. Mason read it at the workbench. He set it down. He sat looking at the wall for a while. 15 years was a long time to carry a thing for it to arrive as 2 paragraphs on company letterhead. The paper was still only paper. but it was also not nothing, and he did not pretend otherwise. The cardboard box that had lived under the workbench for years was emptied on an evening in November. Mason went through the contents methodically, sorting by subject and by date, and transferred everything to a proper file box that he labeled and placed on the back shelf alongside the technical journals. He did not discard a single page. He also did not put anything back under the bench. The box had been the equivalent of a door he had bolted shut and agreed to leave that way, and opening it did not require a ceremony. It required only deciding that the reason for concealing it no longer applied. The decision was made in a moment of complete quiet. No one was there to observe it. The most durable changes tend to be those. The Mustang was installed in the main lobby of Whitmore Tower in early December, beneath the central atrium, where it could be seen from 3 floors of interior balconies. A small placard stood beside it. It gave Edward Whitmore's name, his years, and a single line that Alexandra had written herself. He kept his promises late. Every morning before the building filled, she came through the lobby on her way to the elevator and paused near the car. Briefly, without making anything of it, just long enough to feel the full weight of what it had taken to get from there to here, and to let it be something she carried without flinching. She was learning, slowly, that this was what it meant to not close a thing before it had finished becoming what it was. 3 weeks after the gala, a second sign appeared below the faded board above the door of Cole's Auto. It was clean and simply lettered, specialized in classic restoration. Mason installed it himself on a clear Tuesday morning and opened the shop at 6 as always. He made coffee. He sat at the workbench. On the surface of the bench, in a spot where he would have noticed it immediately when he walked in, there was a white envelope that had not been there the night before. The front door had been locked. There were 2 keys in existence. He recognized the handwriting without having to think about it. The same deliberate, slightly forward-leaning script he had last seen on an envelope wedged behind a dashboard panel in a car that had not run in 40 years, addressed then to Alexandra and addressed now to him. He picked it up. He held it in both hands in the quiet of the shop, the morning light just beginning to come through the bay door windows, Glenwood Street still and gray outside. He did not open it right away. He set it back down on the bench, looked at it for a long moment, and then, without deciding to, without reason he could have named, he smiled. Not at the envelope and not at anything particular. Just the way a person smiles when something that has been wrong for a very long time is finally, at last, beginning to come right.